In the spring of 1291, the long story of Latin rule on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean reached a dramatic turning point. Mamluk forces under Sultan al-Ashraf, Khalil, stormed the city of Acre, the last great stronghold of the Crusader world. When the walls finally collapsed and the harbour fell silent, many people of the time felt that an era had ended. Other Christian outposts still survived for a short while, yet Acre had become a symbol of the Latin presence, and its destruction seemed to close a chapter that had begun 2 centuries earlier. 100 years before, in 1191, Acre had been the prize that revived Crusader fortunes during the Third Crusade, and its capture then had signalled the rebirth of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The treaty that followed at Jaffa merely confirmed what the fall of the city had already announced. After the disaster at Hattin in 1187, when Saladin shattered the armies of the kingdom, Latin power had nearly vanished. Yet from the ruins a smaller state slowly emerged, clinging to the coast and a handful of inland corridors. For almost a century this second kingdom endured. Not because of overwhelming strength, but because the Muslim world was often divided against itself. Whenever rival dynasties quarrelled, the Christians found room to breathe. Only with the rise of the Mamluks in Egypt and their gradual unification of Syria and Palestine did the balance shift decisively. Through the 1260s, one fortress after another fell, until only a fragile chain of ports remained to face the final storm. It would be a mistake, however, to see this later kingdom as a mere shadow of the first. Recent generations have shown that the 13th century in the Latin East was not simply a time of decay. Political life remained vigorous, and the nobles of the realm argued fiercely over law, rights, and the limits of royal power. Their resistance to the demands of Emperor Frederick II revealed a society still confident in its institutions. Even as territory shrank, debates about justice and authority filled the courts of Acre and Tyre, proving that the Crusader world was more than a fading garrison on foreign soil. For a long time, the military history of this period was treated in a narrow way. Early writers preferred to describe a handful of famous battles, chosen because they appeared dramatic or tactically interesting. Warfare was reduced to a sequence of heroic charges and defeats, isolated from the politics and daily life that gave them meaning. Only in the middle of the 20th century did historians begin to place fighting back into its broader setting, showing how deeply war shaped every aspect of the Latin East. Castles, trade, feudal obligations, and even religious disputes were all touched by the constant need for defence. Yet the 13th century still received less attention than the age of the First Crusaders. Apart from the vivid account of the Battle of Mansoura, written by John of Joinville, few contemporary narratives were examined with care. Some scholars imagine that medieval commanders planned their campaigns with the precision of classical generals, and were able to carry out complex maneuvers at will. Such views often relied on uncritical readings of the sources and ignored the confusion and uncertainty that marked real battles. In the clash near Gaza in 1239, for example, the Crusaders chose to camp in a vulnerable valley of their own accord. Yet later, writers blamed Muslim strategy for their misfortune. The reluctance of mounted knights to abandon their infantry and the shortage of arrows among the crossbowmen were facts that did not fit elegant theories and were therefore forgotten. Other historians produced sweeping surveys of medieval warfare but treated the later Kingdom of Jerusalem as little more than a footnote. They concentrated on invasions of Egypt or on the grand crusading expeditions launched from Europe, as if these were separate from the everyday struggle to defend the coast of Palestine. Fortifications attracted greater interest, yet even here the focus was usually architectural. Massive walls were measured and classified, while the lives of the men who garrisoned them remained in the shadows. Only careful archaeological work has begun to reveal how these castles functioned as centres of local power, protecting villages, collecting revenues, and providing refuge in times of raid. The military orders formed another essential pillar of defence. The Templars and Hospitallers held many of the strongest fortresses and supplied disciplined troops when the secular nobility could no longer meet its obligations. Their rules described in detail how a brother should behave on campaign, how marches were to be organised, and how booty was to be shared. Yet for a long time their role was discussed only in broad political narratives. Modern research has started to uncover the complex organisation that lay behind their military efforts and the extent to which the survival of the Latin states depended upon them. Narrative histories of the Crusader kingdom inevitably revolve around war, for almost every political decision was made under the shadow of invasion. The geography of the land shaped strategy. Narrow coastal plains, rugged hills, and isolated oases dictated where armies could move and where treaties might draw their lines. Understanding the terrain allows a clearer view of events such as the cautious marches of 1217, or the disastrous expedition from Jaffa 2 decades later. Military service, feudal rights, and the poverty of many lords were inseparable issues. As estates dwindled, nobles sold lands to the orders, and constitutional quarrels often masked a desperate search for protection. To grasp the full picture, one must listen to many voices. Chronicles written in Old French describe sieges and raids from within the cities, while Arabic historians record the same events from the opposing camps. Letters carried to Europe speak of fear, hope, and the need for men and money. Legal texts reveal how society expected soldiers to behave, and travellers' accounts show the scars that decades of conflict left on the countryside. Together, these fragments form a mosaic of military life that extends far beyond the clash of armies. Visual evidence from the 13th century can reveal details about war that written records sometimes overlook. Images from the period are not straightforward mirrors of reality, and they often mix observation with symbolism, exaggeration, and artistic style. Even so, when an illustration can be compared with descriptions found in chronicles or letters, it can offer cautious but useful clues. Manuscript paintings, seals, coins, carved effigies, and stone reliefs all show that artists were fascinated by soldiers, weapons, and the machinery of siege warfare. Because surviving pieces of actual equipment from this century are rare, drawings of helmets, mail, shields, crossbows, and siege engines sometimes become important for understanding what people believed a battlefield looked like. The challenge is always the same: separating what the artist likely saw from what the artist imagined. When that balance can be managed, imagery becomes a supporting witness, not a replacement for written sources. One famous example is a miniature produced not long after the fall of Acre, which offers a near-contemporary visual impression of the catastrophe and preserves something of how the loss of the Holy Land was pictured by people close to the event. Another way to build a clearer view of warfare in this region is through fieldwork. The landscape itself still carries traces of conflict. Ruined towers, broken walls, altered coastlines, and the ghost outlines of fortresses that once controlled roads and valleys. Walking these places makes it easier to understand why certain towns mattered, why some passes were avoided, and why a single hill could dominate movement for miles. Field study also highlights obstacles that written sources mention only briefly, such as heat, humidity, seasonal rains, and the uneven terrain that could punish armies used to Western European conditions. Like artistic evidence, field observations are most valuable when they are used alongside texts, either confirming what a source claims or exposing what it leaves uncertain. By combining these different kinds of material, it becomes possible to form a broad, grounded picture of military life in the Latin East, from the period after the Third Crusade until the final collapse at Acre. The story does not belong only to one small strip of coastline. Latin settlements and their military struggles stretched across several linked zones. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli in the north, the Armenian Kingdom on the edge of the mountains, and the island Kingdom of Cyprus, which increasingly became the supply base and political partner of the mainland outposts. Campaigns launched against Egypt also matter, because fighting between Christians and Muslims followed similar patterns, whether it happened on the Nile or along the Palestinian coast. Conflicts within the Christian world matter too. Civil wars, rival factions, and clashes between allies created a second layer of warfare that shaped the region's survival just as much as battles against Muslim armies. Soldiers serving in the East often had to be ready for both kinds of enemies, sometimes in the same year, sometimes in the same campaign season. To make sense of such a complicated military environment, a thematic approach is often more revealing than a strict year-by-year narrative. Individual battle accounts are usually incomplete, filled with gaps, rumours, and self-serving explanations. Even the most vivid eyewitness descriptions tend to record scattered moments, rather than a full tactical picture. When historians treat a single clash as if it were perfectly documented, the result can become misleading. The source's distortions combine with the modern desire for tidy explanations, and a messy event is forced into a clean story. A better method is to look for patterns across many engagements and then return to specific incidents with that larger framework in mind. Instead of treating each battle as a complete lesson on its own, it is more useful to identify what kinds of tactics and decisions generally made sense in the Latin East. Where manpower was limited, distances were short but harsh, and strongholds mattered as much as field armies. The military history of the period can be understood through two large themes: how resources were organised, and how those resources were used. On the first side stands manpower. The Latin armies were never a single uniform force. Their soldiers came from local nobles, urban militias, military orders, hired troops, and temporary influxes of crusaders from overseas. The quality and reliability of these troops varied sharply, and their presence often depended on political agreement and money rather than loyalty alone. The Crusades themselves brought sudden bursts of strength, but these surges came with problems: short service periods, different command cultures, and competing priorities that often pulled strategy away from local needs. Alongside manpower stood the second great asset: fortified places. The Latin East was a world of strongpoints. Some were small coastal towers, built to watch roads and protect farmland. Others were massive castles, designed to dominate whole districts and survive long sieges. Coastal towns, walled ports, and fortified cities became even more important over time, because they linked the settlement to sea routes and to the resources of Europe. As inland territory became harder to hold, these ports turned into the backbone of Latin survival. The crucial issue was never simply whether a fortress existed, but whether it could be maintained, repaired, supplied, and garrisoned with enough men to make its walls meaningful. With resources established, the main forms of military action come into view. Three types of operation shaped territorial control throughout the period: raids, battles, and sieges. Raids were frequent and often routine, a way to damage an opponent's economy, test defences, gather prisoners, or punish rivals. Battles were dramatic but less common than people imagine, because commanders understood the risk of losing their limited troops in a single day. Sieges, however, were often decisive. A fortress taken meant territory gained. A fortress lost meant roads closed, villages exposed, and entire regions weakened. In the long run, the fate of the Latin presence was tied more closely to the slow grind of siege warfare than to heroic charges in the open field. All of this unfolded within a landscape that shaped everything. Syria and Palestine offered habitable land in a narrow band between sea and desert, but Latin control rarely reached the natural limits of that band. Most settlement concentrated on the coastal plain, which could support agriculture and trade, even if prosperity was never as high as it had been in earlier centuries. Rainfall was seasonal and uneven, and the mountains east of the coast stored water that slowly fed lower ground through the dry months. Forested areas were more extensive than they are today, affecting hunting, movement, and sometimes the hiding places of raiders. Parallel mountain ranges ran down the region, broken by the great valleys of the Orontes and the Jordan. The Jordan Valley dropped steadily below sea level as it ran south, creating a corridor of intense heat that could become a deadly trap for an army. Climate surprised many Western arrivals. Coastal winters were relatively mild, but summers could be punishing, thick with humidity. Inland areas sometimes offered cooler air, but not always, and the Jordan Valley could become a furnace. Heat exhaustion, water shortages, and disease were not side details. They shaped marching speeds, the timing of campaigns, and the ability to hold a field army together. Warfare in this region was therefore not a sequence of isolated major wars, but a constant background pressure. Even in years that appear quiet in chronicles, small clashes likely continued. Ambushes, skirmishes, local raids, and broken truces that never rose to the level of a famous battle. In the northern Latin lands, the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli often looked more stable than the Kingdom of Jerusalem, at least early in the century. Yet stability did not mean peace. Succession disputes pulled in neighbouring powers and the military orders, while coastal politics and merchant rivalries created further instability. Over time, Antioch became increasingly isolated as Muslim power tightened around it. And when the great Mamluk offensives began, that isolation turned deadly. Antioch eventually fell, and Tripoli endured longer but followed the same path. In this region, the military orders played a major role, holding powerful castles and conducting aggressive raiding policies that sometimes kept Muslim neighbours off balance. Some fortresses resisted repeated assaults for years, proving how much local survival could depend on a single fortified ridge or harbour. The Southern Kingdom's situation is often summarised as a simple decline. Land gained, then lost, till only the coast remained. The reality was more tangled. Strongholds changed hands more than once, and diplomacy mattered almost as much as violence. The 13th century saw moments when territory expanded through agreement rather than conquest. Muslim rulers, divided by rivalry, sometimes offered concessions to secure allies or buy time. At other moments, the same rulers dismantled forts and walls in advance, denying the Latins the chance to benefit fully from any territorial grant. Even when towns or castles were returned in theory, there was no guarantee the Latins could rebuild them or keep enough troops inside them to make them defensible. A castle that looks impressive on paper is meaningless if no garrison can be paid, no food stored, and no repairs made after an earthquake or bombardment. After the Third Crusade, the kingdom that survived was largely coastal. Ports, market towns, and a narrow strip of defended shoreline. Over the following decades, there were occasional gains, occasional disasters, and long stretches of uneasy truce punctuated by raids. Major crusading expeditions changed the military balance temporarily, but rarely in a way that permanently transformed local security. The Fifth Crusade, for example, produced dramatic results in Egypt, but left the mainland kingdom in a complicated position, with some fortifications improved and others deliberately demolished by Muslim defenders to prevent future use. The expedition ended in failure, and the price was not only lost men, but also strategic opportunity. Later, negotiations brought surprising territorial recoveries. Yet some of these gains were strategically awkward, expensive to defend, or exposed to counterattack. Inland corridors could stretch resources thin, and isolated sites could not easily support one another. Fortification and garrisoning were always the true tests. Some places were rebuilt, and the rebuilding itself became a form of warfare, a statement that the Latins intended to hold land, not merely claim it. But the window of opportunity often closed fast. Sites were retaken by force, sometimes with little or no relief attempt, revealing how vulnerable even recovered territory could be. The last real reinforcement of the Latin defences came not from a lasting conquest, but from a ruler who understood the problem of survival. After his failure in Egypt, Louis IX remained in the region and invested in fortifications and a steady military presence. That contribution mattered for years, yet it could not reverse the larger trend. Within a decade, the rise of a new power in Egypt changed the war completely. The Mamluks, forged in military discipline and driven by a more unified strategic purpose, turned siege warfare into a systematic method of reduction. Instead of occasional raids or limited attacks, they applied steady pressure, targeting key strongpoints and stripping away the network that allowed the Latin settlement to function. By the early 1270s, the mainland kingdom was reduced to scattered coastal positions, walled cities and a few major castles, often operating like separate islands of power. Treaties could freeze borders for a time, but stability did not mean safety. Without the ability to launch sustained campaigns, the Latins could rarely do more than endure. Crusading expeditions arriving late in the century carried more symbolism than force. Small raids might be attempted. An isolated fortress might be threatened. But these actions could not restore lost ground. Western Europe's attention drifted toward other rivalries, and plans for major expeditions repeatedly collapsed into politics at home. Meanwhile, the Muslim world itself had passed through its own transformation. After Saladin's death, power fragmented into a family federation of competing rulers. That disunity sometimes benefited the Latins, especially when rival princes sought Frankish support against each other. Yet the same Muslim system proved capable of surviving the shock of Crusader invasions of Egypt, even during moments of internal crisis. In 1250, the political order in Egypt shifted again when the Mamluks seized power. Their early years were not perfectly stable, and they faced challenges from surviving Ayyubid claims. Then, a far greater danger appeared from the east. The Mongol advance, which swept through the region with terrifying speed. The Mongol capture of major cities shattered the old balance and forced new decisions. When the Mamluks defeated a Mongol force in 1260, they did more than win a battle. They positioned themselves as the leading defenders of the region and cleared the way for a new phase of war against the remaining Latin strongholds. Under Baybars and his successors, the Mamluks combined Egypt and Syria under a more effective war machine. Their campaigns hit the Latin East in waves, capturing ports, reducing castles, and breaking the chain of defences that had held for generations. Each captured strongpoint narrowed the Latins' options, weakened supply routes, and increased fear in the surviving towns. After Baybars, later sultans continued the same strategy. Major fortresses that had resisted for decades eventually capitulated, one after another. Coastal cities fell, and by the end of the century, even the last great centre, Acre, could no longer be saved. When it fell in 1291, The remaining Frankish positions were either taken quickly or abandoned, and the long experiment of Latin rule on the mainland came to an end. For most of the 13th century, the Christian communities of the eastern Mediterranean lived with a permanent shortage of soldiers. Only in the rare years when a major crusading expedition arrived from Europe did the Latin states possess anything close to numerical security. In ordinary times, the resident population could probably muster no more than 2,000 mounted men equipped in the manner of knights, and even that figure represented an optimistic ceiling rather than a dependable reality. Against them stood Muslim powers, whose military resources were far greater. The Ayyubid Confederation was capable of fielding tens of thousands of cavalry, while later the Mamluk regime created armies that were larger still and better organized. The imbalance was obvious to every contemporary observer and shaped nearly every strategic decision made by the Christians. The strength of the Muslim armies did not lie only in their size, but also in their structure. The Mamluks, who came to dominate Egypt and Syria after 1250, were military slaves trained from youth for the profession of war. The word slave in this context did not imply degradation. These men were purchased, educated, and drilled with the expectation that many would rise to high office. By the later 13th century, this system had produced a disciplined elite that formed the core of the Sultan's power. Alongside them stood the Halka, a body of free cavalry that could be mobilized when campaigns were planned. Additional forces were drawn from Bedouin tribes, Turkoman horsemen, and volunteers motivated by religious enthusiasm. The result was a flexible military machine able to respond quickly to opportunities on the frontier. The Mamluk rulers invested heavily in training and equipment. Hippodromes were built for exercises in archery, lance work, wrestling, and riding. Manuals of horsemanship circulated, and regular reviews inspected the readiness of troops. The mounted archer was the dominant figure of this system. Lightly armed and riding swift horses, these soldiers could harass heavier opponents, shower them with arrows, and withdraw before a counterattack developed. When necessary, they were also capable of closing in for hand-to-hand combat. Such methods had challenged Western armies for centuries, and in the 13th century they remained just as effective. Muslim infantry played a supporting role, but were far from insignificant. During great emergencies, vast numbers of townsmen and peasants could be called to arms. Their quality varied, yet in sieges they provided essential labour for mining, building engines, and launching assaults. The Mamluk approach to warfare relied on a combination of bombardment, tunnelling beneath walls, and sudden storming attacks. Over time, this method proved devastating to the Christian strongholds scattered along the coast. Christian forces were far more fragmented. The backbone of the Latin armies remained the knightly class, men whose social position and economic resources allowed them to maintain expensive equipment and several horses. The costs of armour, weapons, and mounts were immense, and only the wealthier families could sustain them. Knights were supported by mounted and foot sergeants, whose gear was lighter and whose status was lower, but whose role was indispensable. The military orders provided another vital element. Templar and Hospitaller brethren were organised, disciplined, and often better trained than secular knights, yet even they struggled to replace losses and maintain adequate numbers. Infantry archers and crossbowmen were equally important. Individual marksmen could decide the outcome of skirmishes or defend walls with deadly effect. Engineers, carpenters, and miners formed a small but essential specialist corps responsible for maintaining siege engines and repairing fortifications. Without them, even the strongest castle quickly deteriorated. Feudal obligations continued to shape recruitment. Lords summoned their vassals to serve in person, and these vassals in turn brought retainers, or hired companions. The system had not disappeared despite the gradual loss of territory. In fact, personal service remained more crucial in the East than in Western Europe, where money payments increasingly replaced attendance in the field. Yet the pool of available men was shallow. Many fiefs could no longer support the traditional number of knights, and mercenaries had to fill the gaps. Urban communities and religious houses were sometimes required to provide additional soldiers when danger became acute. Civil conflict further weakened this fragile structure. From the 1220s onward, rival factions fought bitterly over the control of Cyprus and the mainland kingdom. Battles were fought not against Muslims, but between Christians themselves, draining resources that could scarcely be spared. Sieges of cities such as Beirut and Kyrenia consumed months of effort, while the Italian merchant republics turned Acre into a battleground for their own commercial rivalries. Contemporary witnesses lamented the destruction of towers and houses and spoke of thousands killed in these internecine struggles. The northern principalities suffered similar disorders. Disputes over the succession to Antioch drew in Armenians, military orders, and neighbouring Muslim rulers. For years, castles changed hands, villages were burned, and alliances shifted unpredictably. Later, the powerful Embriaco family rebelled repeatedly against the princes of Tripoli, provoking campaigns that resembled private wars more than a united Christian defence. Each outbreak eroded the already limited capacity to resist external attack. Strategic thinking among the Latins was therefore constrained. In theory, they hoped to expand by capturing enemy strongholds and by launching raids that weakened Muslim resources. In practice, they rarely possessed enough men to risk large field battles, and their efforts focused on holding what remained. Castles and walled ports became lifelines. When a Muslim army advanced, the usual response was to withdraw behind stone rather than to meet it in the open. This policy sometimes succeeded, yet it depended on well-supplied garrisons and on relief forces that were often unavailable. The Muslim approach was more coherent. Raids were integrated into broader campaigns designed to isolate a fortress before a formal siege began. Mobility allowed Mamluk columns to threaten several places at once, confusing Christian commanders and preventing concentration of defence. Once a target was chosen, engineers, miners, and archers combined to break resistance methodically. Over decades, this strategy reduced the Latin presence to a string of coastal enclaves. The feudal levies of the Latin East were never sufficient on their own to defend the fragile Christian states. Their numbers were too small, their resources too scattered, and their internal rivalries too deep. Yet alongside this weakened feudal structure, there existed institutions that offered a more stable and continuous form of military power. Above all stood the military orders, organisations that combined religious devotion with professional warfare. From the 12th century onward, these orders gradually assumed a central role in protecting the remaining Christian territories. Their strength did not depend solely on the men they could recruit locally, but on the vast network of estates they controlled across Europe. These lands supplied grain, horses, weapons, and, most importantly, money, with which to hire additional soldiers. Papal support and the donations of believers further increased their wealth, allowing them to maintain garrisons and pay mercenaries at times when the local nobility could barely meet its own obligations. By the 13th century, three major orders dominated the military landscape: the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights. Each maintained its own castles, fleets, and field forces, and together they represented the closest thing the Latin East possessed to a standing army. Contemporary observers often regarded their brother knights as the elite of Christian warfare, disciplined men bound by strict rules and long experience. The number of these knights was not large, perhaps a few hundred in total, but their value lay in organisation rather than quantity. They were supported by brother sergeants, squires, and a wide variety of hired troops, creating mixed forces capable of both garrison duty and field operations. The armies of the orders were remarkably diverse. Alongside full members fought volunteers who joined for limited periods, attracted by the prestige of service in a holy institution. Many Western knights preferred to fight under the banners of the orders, rather than as independent pilgrims, believing that this offered greater honour and spiritual reward. Mercenaries formed another crucial element. Crossbowmen, mounted sergeants, and engineers were employed on regular wages, and in major campaigns these paid soldiers could outnumber the brethren themselves. In the castles of the orders, such as the great fortress of Safe, only a minority of the garrison were professed brothers. The rest were hired specialists or locally recruited auxiliaries. Among the most distinctive of these auxiliaries were the Turcopoles, troops who fought in the style of the local Muslim cavalry. Some were native Christians, others Westerners, who had adopted Eastern equipment and tactics. They provided speed and flexibility that heavy knights lacked, and they often served as scouts or the first line in battle. The Templar regulations reveal how carefully these men were integrated into the military system, placed under their own commanders, but operating within the discipline of the order. In many engagements, the number of Turcopoles equaled that of the brother knights, demonstrating how essential they had become. The orders also inherited feudal obligations when they acquired lordships from impoverished nobles. Villages and castles passed into their hands brought with them the service of local knights and sergeants, ensuring that traditional structures continued to function under new masters. Yet the orders were more than landlords. They acted as strategic planners and advisors. Their leaders were present at every major council, influencing decisions on truces, alliances, and the direction of crusading expeditions. Even when internal politics divided the Latin states, the military orders remained the most reliable component of resistance. Their discipline distinguished them from the rest of the Christian forces. The Templar statutes describe in detail how camps were to be guarded, how alarms were to be answered, and how charges were to be delivered. Such rules were not theoretical. During the Fifth Crusade, a Muslim attack broke through the disordered ranks of the French troops, yet the Templars, advancing behind their banner, restored the situation and drove the enemy out. Similar examples appeared again and again. On raids, in sieges, and in desperate defensive actions, the orders displayed a cohesion rarely matched by secular contingents. Nevertheless, they were not free from error. Ambitious commanders sometimes launched reckless expeditions, and rivalry between the orders could weaken Christian unity. The Templars and Hospitallers frequently supported opposing political factions, and in the civil wars of the mid-13th century, they even fought on different sides. Yet when facing Muslim armies, they usually cooperated, providing the backbone of every major campaign. At La Forbie, at Mansoura, and in the final defence of Acre, their brethren died in large numbers, earning a reputation that even their enemies acknowledged. The most visible expression of their power lay in stone. Across Palestine and Syria, the orders controlled an arc of fortresses that dominated roads, harbours, and mountain passes. Some they built from nothing, such as the mighty castle of Château Pèlerin, raised on a rocky promontory within a few months. Others they reconstructed from ruins, like Safe, whose restoration consumed vast sums and years of labour. In northern Syria, the Hospitallers held the impregnable Crac des Chevaliers and Margat. while the Templars guarded Tortosa, Bagaras, and Chastelblanc. These strongholds were more than shelters. They were administrative centres, supply depots, and symbols of Christian endurance. As the 13th century progressed, many secular lords, unable to bear the costs of defence, transferred their territories to the orders. Arsuf, Sidon, Beaufort, and numerous lesser sites passed into their hands. Such transactions reveal the desperation of the local nobility and the confidence placed in the military orders. Yet, possession of castles also meant constant strain. Garrisoning, repairing, and provisioning these fortresses required enormous resources. And when Mamluk armies began systematic siege, warfare, even the strongest walls could not guarantee safety. Alongside the orders, another source of reinforcement emerged from Europe: permanent companies and confraternities of volunteers. Unlike the Great Crusades, these groups provided continuous, rather than episodic aid. Urban communities in Italy and France organised brotherhoods, whose members served in the Holy Land for set periods, often arriving with merchant fleets and remaining through the campaigning season. Some were crossbowmen, others simple foot soldiers, but collectively they formed a valuable supplement to the dwindling local forces. The most important of these initiatives was the French regiment established by King Louis IX after his failed crusade. Determined that his efforts shouldn't end in abandonment, Louis left behind a paid garrison of knights, sergeants, and crossbowmen under the command of Geoffrey of Sergines. Financed from royal revenues, this unit became a permanent fixture of the kingdom's defences. Its leaders frequently held high office, acting as seneschals or lieutenants and participating in every major operation from Jaffa to Tripoli. Over the decades, the regiment faced chronic financial difficulties. Payments from France were irregular, and commanders were forced to borrow locally to keep their men in the field. Yet the unit endured, reinforced at times by new contingents sent from Europe. Under figures such as Oliver of Termes and John of Grailly, it fought in raids, defended cities, and stood guard during the last desperate years. At the Siege of Acre, its soldiers held the Tower of the Legate until wounds and exhaustion forced them back, a final testimony to decades of service. The papacy never attempted to maintain a permanent army in the eastern Mediterranean in the way that the French crown eventually did. Yet, its influence on the military survival of the Latin states was continuous and substantial. Support came most visibly in the form of money granted to individual crusaders or to large expeditions. But papal assistance took many other shapes as well. Funds collected in Europe could be used to hire soldiers who were already in the Holy Land, to pay for transport across the sea, or to equip fleets that would protect the coast. At moments of crisis, the papal court often preferred to send immediate help, rather than wait for the slow organisation of a formal crusade. During the early 1260s, the attention of the popes was largely absorbed by the struggle for Sicily, and the eastern frontier received only limited concern. Even so, the supply of troops to Palestine never entirely ceased. Reports of the fall of Arsuf, Caesarea, and Safed alarmed the papal curia, and urgent orders were issued for preaching the cross and for the dispatch of 500 crossbowmen on the spring passage. Maritime republics were instructed to prepare galleys, and the money already collected in various dioceses was directed toward fitting out ships for the relief of the coast. These measures reveal a growing awareness that the Latin cities needed immediate reinforcement, not promises of a distant campaign. Throughout the 1270s, both the French monarchy and the papacy continued to provide soldiers for the defence of the remaining ports. Contingents arriving under commanders such as Giles of Sancy and William of Roussillon were financed partly by church revenues, suggesting a coordinated effort between Paris and Rome. At the end of the decade, the Pope organised a fleet from Venice and Genoa, placing the Patriarch of Jerusalem in charge of its maintenance once it reached the Levant. Practical difficulties soon appeared. Many of the vessels were poorly equipped, and the Patriarch was advised to retain only those that were properly armed and manned. The episode illustrates both the importance of naval power and the constant problems of turning papal intentions into effective action. Money was often sent directly to the east, with few conditions attached. Early in the century, the Patriarch and the leaders of the Templars and Hospitallers received substantial sums to be spent according to local needs. Later, popes followed the same pattern, dispatching thousands of livres and leaving the choice of expenditure to the men on the spot. Such freedom allowed the funds to be used for the hiring of troops, the purchase of supplies, or the repair of fortifications. At times, the Patriarch himself arrived with soldiers paid from these resources, though warnings were issued to avoid recruiting unreliable adventurers. Large crusading expeditions rarely achieved the strategic goals of the Latin states. Yet the constant trickle of men and money from the west remained essential. Without this outside assistance, the coastal enclaves could scarcely have survived as long as they did. Still, the aid was never sufficient to create a decisive strategy capable of halting Muslim expansion. Paid soldiers formed an integral part of every army in the region. The French regiment left behind by Louis IX lived on European revenues, and feudal obligations within the kingdom frequently required the employment of hired companions. The military orders depended heavily on mercenaries, especially for long-term garrison duty, and even the most prestigious castles were filled with men who served for wages rather than vows. Civil wars among the Christians demonstrated how readily such troops could be found. During the conflict between the Lombard faction and the Ibelines on Cyprus, German, Flemish, and Italian mercenaries fought on both sides, while the Genoese provided ships in return for commercial privileges. Sieges at Kyrenia and Tyre relied on hired sergeants and sailors, and the Italian communes repeatedly filled their galleys with men paid by the day. In northern Syria, similar forces were employed during the rebellions around Tripoli, where many of the soldiers were Genoese. The equipment carried by the Latin armies changed little, despite the harsh conditions of the Near East. Chainmail remained the basis of a knight's protection, supplemented by plates for the legs and shoulders, and covered by a padded garment. Sergeants wore lighter versions of the same armour, and contemporary effigies show no significant difference between what was used in Europe and what was worn in Palestine. Helmets varied from simple iron hats to the great visored helm that enclosed the entire face. Shields grew smaller and more triangular, while swords, lances, and maces completed the familiar array. Horses, the most valuable possession of any warrior, were also given armour and iron headpieces. Preparations for a campaign required endless labour. Mail had to be greased, blades sharpened, and mounts shod and covered. Yet the weight of this equipment creates serious difficulties. In the dust of a ploughed field or the sand of the coastal plain, heavily armed knights could scarcely manoeuvre. Chronicles of several battles describe how men were knocked from their horses and lay helpless beneath the burden of steel. The heat of summer campaigns brought thirst, exhaustion, and sometimes death, and few allowances were made for these realities. The constant arrival of new contingents from the West may explain why adaptation was so limited. Because manpower was scarce, strongpoints became the foundation of defence. Soldiers were dispersed among castles and walled towns, unable to leave their posts without exposing neighbouring districts. When Ascalon was threatened in the 1240s, no relief could be organised because every garrison was tied to its own walls. Yet these fortresses were not merely shelters. They served as bases for raids, centres of administration, and visible symbols of Christian rule. the military orders gradually assumed responsibility for many of them. With revenues drawn from across Europe, they could afford the enormous costs of construction and maintenance. Safed was rebuilt with a mixture of Christian workers and Muslim prisoners, and even after completion it consumed tens of thousands of besants each year. Crac des Chevaliers benefited from royal and papal grants, while smaller sites such as Mont Didier and Tour Rouge passed into Hospitaller hands when local monasteries could no longer defend them. Occasionally, the orders received castles that were still in Muslim possession, gifts intended to encourage future reconquest. They also assisted in the defence of towns they did not own, competing for the honour of guarding particular towers or gates. Tripoli, on the eve of its fall, still contained both ancient and newly built structures maintained by these institutions. Crusading armies provided valuable labour for fortification. The castle of Sidon rose during the pause before Frederick II's arrival, and Richard of Cornwall rebuilt Ascalon with the help of the orders and the barons. Louis IX devoted more than a year to strengthening Caesarea and later repaired Sidon with high walls and deep ditches. Such projects relied on the presence of thousands of pilgrims who could be employed as masons, carpenters, and porters. Not all nobles surrendered their responsibilities. John of Beirut restored his own city without assistance from the orders, using revenues from Cyprus and gifts from supporters. Tiberius and Jaffa were likewise maintained by their lords, though Jaffa eventually fell despite extensive efforts and Western subsidies. In the north, the Lord of Maraclea even constructed a new island fortress, provoking Muslim demands for its destruction. Architecturally, the castles varied widely. Early structures often centered on a massive tower within a surrounding wall, a design familiar from Europe. Later, builders favored concentric layouts in which an inner line of defense dominated the outer one, as seen at Crac des Chevaliers and Chateau Pellerin. Coastal cities such as Caesarea relied almost entirely on artificial walls, while inland strongholds took advantage of ridges, promontories, and steep valleys. The choice of site balanced natural security with accessibility. A fortress had to be defensible, yet still capable of controlling roads and farmland. When the fortifications of a castle were finally completed, the task was only beginning. A strong point had to be filled with men, equipped with engines and stocked with food and supplies before it could play any real role in the defence of the coast. The exact layout of many of these citadels is still debated, yet archaeological traces reveal how carefully their builders tried to combine natural features with artificial strength. At Ascalon, for example, the remains on the northern side of the ancient mound dominate the surrounding plain far more effectively than those in the south. A rock-cut ditch separates this area from the rest of the site, and a sloping glacis of smooth ashlar masonry resembles the 13th century work seen at Caesarea. Such evidence suggests that the castle reconstructed there was conceived on concentric principles, with layers of defence designed to slow and exhaust an attacker. The destruction inflicted on Ascalon in the mid-13th century has obscured much of this work. Later, demolitions removed most traces of the citadel, leaving only fragments of towers and walls. Yet one detail still visible along the eastern rampart shows the ingenuity of the builders. Ancient marble and granite columns were laid horizontally through the masonry, acting like giant pins that bound the wall together. This technique was not merely decorative. It strengthened the structure against battering and undermining. Similar columns appear at Caesarea and Arsuf, where the softer stone around them has eroded, leaving the polished shafts standing proud of the surface. Travellers of the period also noticed iron clamps embedded in the walls of Beirut, another attempt to give fragile masonry greater resilience. A town's first line of defence was often the moat. Around Caesarea, the ditch and glacis remain impressive, and the design of the gates reveals how carefully movement was controlled. Anyone approaching the eastern entrance had to cross a drawbridge, while exposed to arrows from several directions, then turn sharply through a vaulted chamber before reaching the streets beyond. Such arrangements would have made even peaceful access slow and uncomfortable, and a hostile assault almost suicidal. Arrow slits pierced the glacis and the towers above it, allowing defenders to concentrate fire while remaining protected. Similar slits can still be seen at Belvoir, where their narrow shape forced archers into cramped positions, and at Muslim fortresses such as Subaybe and Mount Tabor, demonstrating a shared architectural language across the region. Castles were not intended to remain entirely passive. Small postern doors allowed sorties into the moat or the surrounding fields, though such exits had to be guarded carefully to prevent infiltration. The military orders imposed strict rules. A brother who left by the wrong door could be expelled from the community. Discipline of this kind was essential when a few dozen men might be responsible for the safety of an entire district. The fortress of Montfort in western Galilee illustrates how natural terrain and engineering were combined. The castle stood on a narrow spur above a deep valley, with a massive D-shaped keep at its eastern end, protected by a wide, rock-cut ditch. Cisterns beneath the buildings ensured an independent water supply, enabling the keep to resist even if the outer works fell. To the west and north, a second line of walls and towers guarded the gentler slopes, creating a semi-concentric system. Rough rubble masonry formed the outer defences, while the keep itself was built of large ashlar blocks, emphasising its role as the final refuge. Despite these precautions, Montfort surrendered to Baybars in 1271, and a mysterious cut in the southern wall may mark the beginnings of a mine that was never completed. Constant maintenance was required to keep such places viable. Earthquakes, weather, and earlier assaults left scars that demanded repair. At Beaufort, the Templars added new fortifications on the southern plateau during the 1260s, only to abandon them first when the Mamluks approached. Western Europe frequently supplied the necessary funds. Popes granted exemptions and subsidies for craques des chevaliers, and similar aid was directed to the patriarchal castle of Cursat after Muslim raids. Sometimes Rome advised that money originally intended for Jerusalem or Ascalon should instead strengthen towns still in Christian hands, a pragmatic recognition of political realities. Provisioning was as vital as masonry. Castles required steady deliveries of grain, wine, leather, and metal, and many maintained workshops for the production of crossbows and arrows. Water was the most precious commodity. At Saphé, a hidden spring saved the builders during construction, and later the surrounding countryside supported numerous mills and gardens. Château Pellerin stood amid fertile fields, and Margat was said to harvest hundreds of cartloads each year. Such abundance could disappear suddenly. A raid on craques des chevaliers stripped the nearby pastures, leaving the fortress short of food when the Great Siege began. Not all strongholds enjoyed such resources. Montfort struggled to feed its garrison and had to lease nearby lands from the Hospitallers, simply to survive. During Christian civil wars, supplies were equally uncertain. At Dieu d'Amour, the defenders were reduced to eating their horses until a lucky sortie captured the besiegers' provisions. Even the most formidable walls were useless if hunger weakened those within. Estimating the size of garrisons is difficult, but scattered evidence suggests that a major castle normally housed around 1,000 people, only a fraction of whom were full-time fighters. At Safet, in the 1260s, more than 1,700 individuals lived within the walls, yet only about 400 were combatants, including 50 brother knights and 30 brother sergeants of the temple. Crossbowmen formed the largest military group, supported by Turco-Poles and various specialists. Similar proportions probably existed at Crac des Chevaliers and Marga, where the number of professed brethren may have been only a few dozen. Such figures underline how thinly stretched the military orders were and how heavily they relied on hired men and local servants. In moments of danger, reinforcements could be sent by sea. Beirut in the early 1230s and Kyrenia soon after were saved by the arrival of additional troops, while Ascalon and Acre received aid from passing fleets. Yet these successes were exceptions. Most garrisons remained isolated, and the permanent fighting element rarely exceeded a few hundred men. Discipline, therefore, became crucial. Gates were shut at night, sentries posted, and every movement regulated. Travellers described the vigilance at Margat, where Hospitallers and their auxiliaries kept constant watch over the approaches. Medieval observers often struggled to explain exactly what the fortresses of the Latin East were meant to achieve. When King Andrew of Hungary visited the region during the Fifth Crusade, he admired the position of Marga, describing it as a barrier set before the lands of the unbelievers. Crac des Chevaliers impressed him even more. He imagined its garrison turning back enemy attacks every day and preserving a fragment of the Holy Land through sheer determination. Such comments reveal admiration rather than analysis. Popes and chroniclers spoke in similar language, praising castles as guardians of the faith or as shields against the enemies of Christ. Yet they rarely considered how these places actually functioned on the ground. Much of this rhetoric served a practical purpose. Glowing descriptions encouraged donations and recruitment in Europe, and they helped sustain morale among the settlers, who depended on these walls for survival. Modern historians, looking beyond the idealized image, have tried to define more precisely what castles could and could not do. They were not simply border barriers, they acted as residences, administrative centres, and symbols of authority. And only in certain circumstances did they influence the wider strategy of the region. Every lordship in the Latin states revolved around a principal town where the main castle stood. Around this nucleus developed markets, harbours, and communities that provided revenue for the local ruler. Coastal towns were especially valuable because trade helped support their defences, whereas many inland strongholds lacked such economic foundations and eventually passed into the hands of the military orders. Even where a castle was not the sole centre of government, it played an executive role in the countryside, supervising villages and collecting produce. Smaller towers and fortified warehouses protected harvests and acted as local administrative posts. At places like Kakun or Kalansu, such structures allowed a distant lord to manage scattered estates and to offer limited protection to the rural population. In some regions, castles became instruments of colonization. The rebuilding of Ascalon was meant to attract settlers, though the surrounding land remained largely deserted. Caesarea offers a clearer example. Once its citadel and walls were restored, new inhabitants began to return. Château Pèlerin transformed a previously Muslim agricultural zone into territory where Christian farmers could work with relative safety. The garrison of Safed drew sustenance from hundreds of nearby villages, and its presence encouraged markets and mills to operate again. Yet, this relationship was fragile. Raids could empty fields overnight, and several strongholds, such as Montfort, suffered chronic shortages despite their imposing appearance. Castles also served as instruments of internal control. The indigenous population did not always accept Latin rule, and occasional uprisings forced garrisons to act as police forces. Disputes between neighbouring communities or between settlers and native peasants were often settled under the shadow of a tower. The military orders maintained strict discipline within their own walls. Brothers who used the wrong gate or neglected guard duty could face expulsion. These rules reveal how vulnerable even the strongest fortress felt when surrounded by uncertain loyalties. Life inside such places was not entirely grim. Hospitaller castles possessed decorated chapels, and Montfort included a hall that may have housed guests and pilgrims. Noble families used their fortresses as residences, meeting places and prisons. Château Pellerin became the principal jail of the Templars, while Neffin, in the county of Tripoli, hosted courts and political assemblies during periods of civil war. Thus, the castle was not only a military installation, but also a stage on which the social and political life of the Latin East unfolded. The defensive value of fortifications varied according to the scale of the threat. Against small raiding parties, a castle could be decisive. Villagers fled behind its gates while marauders ravaged the fields, confident that the stone walls would outlast the storm. When Baybars approached Acre, disguised under false banners, hundreds of peasants who trusted the city's defences were cut down outside the walls, showing how easily such protection could fail. At Sidon, a sudden attack forced the inhabitants into the sea castle, which saved many lives but could not shelter the entire population. Larger sieges tested the limits of these structures. Crac des Chevaliers and Margat resisted repeated assaults for decades, their massive circuits and deep cisterns enabling them to endure isolation. Yet even these giants were not impregnable. When supplies were cut or mining operations began, surrender became inevitable. After the disaster of La Fourby, the rebuilt castle of Ascalon offered a refuge for the remnants of the Christian army, allowing them to retreat safely to Acre. Without such havens, many more would have perished. The question of whether castles could defend frontiers remains controversial. In practice, only a few sites possessed enough men and resources to influence events beyond their immediate surroundings. Saffet and perhaps Château Pellerin could restrict movement across key routes, and the Hospitaller network in northern Syria exerted pressure on Homs and Hama. Most other strongholds, however, were islands in a sea of hostile territory. When the Mamluk armies advanced from Egypt, the coastal chain of Jaffa, Arsuf, and Caesarea could not halt them. Lacking a permanent field army, the Latins watched their outer districts fall while each fortress awaited its own turn. Despite these limitations, castles were not purely passive. They served as bases for expeditions, especially when crusading armies arrived. The Fifth Crusade assembled at Acre before sailing to Egypt. Theobald of Champagne's force used Jaffa as its forward camp. The Lord Edward prepared his operations there as well. Even poorly manned sites could shelter troops temporarily, or provide a rallying point after defeat. Garrison detachments sometimes ventured far from home, joining larger armies or participating in raids, intended to maintain tribute payments, or to disrupt Muslim supply lines. The political conflicts among the Franks themselves also drew castles into the struggle. During the quarrel between the Ibelins and the imperial faction, Beirut, Tyre, and the fortresses of Cyprus changed hands repeatedly, each siege altering the balance of power. In the later wars around Tripoli, the strongholds of Gibelais, Botron, and Neffin became prizes in a bitter family feud, demonstrating how vital control of stone and harbour was to any contender for authority. The history of Jaffa illustrates many of these themes. Rebuilt by Frederick II and later strengthened by King Louis of France, the town became the southern anchor of the kingdom. Papal subsidies, royal labour, and the efforts of its energetic lord turned it into a bustling centre once more. From its walls, crusading armies launched raids into the interior, and on several occasions the garrison repelled superior forces. Yet even Jaffa depended on outside aid and on the uncertain fortunes of war. When Baybars finally moved against it in 1268, the castle that had cost so much devotion could not save the surrounding countryside. Medieval war is often imagined as a succession of thunderous battles. Yet, in the lands along the eastern Mediterranean, the rhythm of conflict followed a different pattern. Fortresses, ports, and walled towns shaped the fate of kingdoms far more than the clash of armies in open fields. During the last decades of the Latin presence in the region, the gradual disappearance of the coastal realm was brought about mainly by relentless siege campaigns led by determined Muslim rulers. Strongholds fell, one after another, not because their defenders were defeated in grand encounters, but because walls were battered, supplies exhausted, and relief never arrived. Open battles still occurred, especially when new crusading expeditions reached the coast. But these confrontations were exceptional moments, rather than the ordinary language of war. The resident Latin communities rarely sought pitched engagements. Their manpower was thinly spread between scattered cities, and every knight stationed in the field was a guard missing from a gate or a tower. Only when fleets from the west delivered fresh contingents did the Christians dare to form true field armies. Even then, experience showed how poorly many newcomers understood the methods of their opponents. Muslim forces relied on mobility, feigned retreats, and the deadly accuracy of mounted archers. Western troops, trained for shock charges against similarly armoured foes, often advanced with confidence only to find themselves harassed, encircled, and slowly worn down. Expeditions led by prominent princes ended in humiliation because commanders misread the unfamiliar battlefield. War in the region blurred the boundaries between raids, sieges, and battles. A mounted raid could suddenly harden into a full confrontation if the pursuers decided to stand and fight. Likewise, defenders inside a fortress sometimes rushed out to challenge besiegers in the open, turning a siege into a brief but violent clash. Two main forms of battle appeared repeatedly. One was the formal encounter in which both sides deliberately chose to meet on a chosen field. The other unfolded during marches when Muslim horsemen, masters of movement, struck columns of crusaders struggling along dusty roads. In such moments, the initiative usually belonged to the riders of the desert. Contemporary descriptions of these struggles must be treated with caution. Chroniclers wrote from narrow viewpoints, often from the saddle or the deck of a ship, seeing only fragments of the chaos. Even eyewitnesses could grasp little beyond the turmoil around them. Accounts of the same event frequently contradict one another, and attempts to reconstruct precise sequences are frustrated by exaggeration and confusion. Yet by comparing many testimonies, a general picture emerges of how armies were raised, how they fought, and why they so often failed. The size of forces engaged in these battles was usually modest. Reports sometimes speak of tens of thousands, but closer inspection suggests that most Christian armies numbered in the hundreds, rather than the thousands. A strong host might include a few hundred knights, several hundred mounted sergeants, and a larger body of infantry and crossbowmen. Muslim armies could draw on greater reserves, especially when major rulers took the field. Yet even they often committed only parts of their strength against the coastal Franks. The imbalance was real but not always overwhelming. The decisive factor lay more in tactics and cohesion than in sheer numbers. Christian armies were composed of distinct elements. Knights on heavy chargers formed the prestigious corps, supported by mounted sergeants and local auxiliaries, known as Turcopoles. Infantrymen, some professional, many simple pilgrims, provided bulk and labour. archers and crossbowmen, indispensable against the swarms of enemy riders, protected the flanks and disrupted attacks. Unfortunately, chroniclers seldom distinguished clearly between these groups, and the exact makeup of any single army remains uncertain. What is clear is that quality varied greatly. Seasoned soldiers of the military orders stood beside untrained volunteers who had never faced a battle before. Combat rarely lasted long. The heat, the weight of armour, and the exhaustion of men and horses limited endurance. A charge that failed to break the enemy quickly could dissolve into disorder. Only when entrenched positions were assaulted, as along the banks of the Nile, did fighting stretch over many hours or even days. Most pitched encounters were brief storms of violence, followed by sudden collapse on one side or the other. Terrain shaped every decision. Open plains favoured the sweeping manoeuvres of Muslim cavalry, while rough ground, sand dunes, or irrigated fields hampered the heavy horses of the Franks. Commanders tried to use rivers, marshes, or hills to shield their flanks, yet the choice of ground was not always theirs. During one expedition, a crusading detachment found itself trapped on steep slopes beneath an enemy castle, forced to withdraw under a rain of missiles, simply because no better position existed. Before battle, armies arranged themselves in ordered groups, known as battalions. Knights clustered according to lordship or family ties, forming units that could charge together. On the march, similar formations were adopted to protect columns from sudden attack. In one campaign along the Nile, infantry guarded one flank while ships paralleled the army on the river, and mounted troops linked the two. Strict proclamations forbade anyone to stray ahead or fall behind, and such discipline spared the Crusaders heavy losses. Yet detailed knowledge of these arrangements is rare. Most narratives leap directly from assembly to confusion. The mounted knight remained the emblem of Christian warfare. Encased in armour and carried by powerful horses, he could smash through lighter opponents with terrifying force. Training within the military orders instilled some degree of collective discipline, but individual pride and ambition often undermined coordination. Knights came from many lands and answered to different leaders. Obedience was fragile. Moments before battle were especially dangerous. Commanders argued, councils hesitated, and precious time slipped away. On more than one occasion, a single noble refused to retreat with the rest, declaring a desire to die for God, and dragged his companions into disaster. Even kings struggled to impose unity. During the fighting near the Egyptian town of Mansoura, repeated changes of plan left troops uncertain whether to advance or withdraw, and the enemy exploited every delay. Fear could spread with equal speed. In a clash on the Nile, not only common soldiers but seasoned knights turned their backs, forcing the military orders to shield the retreat. During another campaign, many crusaders were so drunk on the eve of withdrawal that they could not even mount their horses, and panic completed what the enemy had begun. Conversely, despair sometimes paralysed those who should have acted. At Mansoura, some knights watched helplessly from the opposite bank, while infantry risked their lives to aid the king. Excessive zeal was as harmful as cowardice. Knights eager for glory ignored orders and chased fleeing foes into narrow streets where horses could not maneuver. What began as triumph ended in slaughter when Muslim troops closed the exits. The balance between boldness and restraint proved difficult to maintain. Leaders sought to steady morale through ceremony and faith. Preachers addressed the ranks, banners were blessed, and sacred symbols carried to the front. Such gestures strengthened resolve, but could also inflame passions beyond control. The sight of crosses and chanting priests convinced some Muslim commanders that they faced a holy war, stiffening their own determination. Despite frequent failures, examples of courage shine through the record. defenders surprised in their camp fought through the night half-armed, yet refused to surrender. In a great battle where local allies fled at the first charge, the Latin troops stood their ground until nearly all were cut down. These moments reveal that defeat was not born of cowardice alone, but of structural weakness, strategic disadvantage. The armour that defined a medieval knight was both his shield and his burden. Layers of mail and plate offered remarkable protection against blades and arrows. The same iron shell turned every movement into a labour. Compared with the agile riders of the Muslim armies, the Frankish knight appeared slow and heavy, struggling under the sun with equipment designed for colder fields. Still, this armour gave him confidence. Within the military orders, those wearing the full harness were expected to stand firmer than lightly equipped sergeants, for they were harder to wound and slower to fall. When these armoured horsemen attacked together, their charge could be terrifying. In the warfare of Western Europe, such an assault often decided the day, and Crusaders arriving in the East carried this habit with them. The military orders even preserved detailed routines for delivering a charge. Units were arranged in groups, standards were raised, and selected knights surrounded the banner to guard it. Squires waited with spare horses, ready to replace any mount that collapsed. In theory, the formation advanced as a single moving wall of iron, each rider protecting the next. The reality on eastern battlefields was far less orderly. Muslim commanders rarely offered the solid target that Western knights expected. When a Frankish line thundered forward, the opposing cavalry scattered like birds, only to regroup at the sound of a horn. Arrows darkened the sky, striking men and horses alike. The heavy riders, carried far from their starting point, found it almost impossible to gather again. Contemporary observers recognise this pattern. The charge lost its power because the enemy refused to meet it head-on. Repeated campaigns showed the same sequence. During one retreat along the Nile, Christian knights charged to silence the torment of archers. The Muslims opened their ranks, allowed the horsemen to pass through, and then closed in from behind with swords, clubs, and fire. At Mansoura, years later, a similar desperation forced King Louis to order an assault when his crossbowmen were absent. The manoeuvre gained little. The Muslim host was simply too large and too mobile. Near Acre, another newly arrived noble charged boldly, only to see the enemy melt away and return upon his rear. Time after time, the old European remedy failed in the new environment. Yet the charge was not entirely useless. Against poorly organised foes or in moments of surprise, it could still break a line. One expedition in southern Palestine succeeded when a group of Crusaders struck before the Muslims, could deploy their archers, and a reserve force completed the victory. Such successes were rare, however, and depended more on circumstance than on the method itself. Muslim armies, unlike their Frankish opponents, adapted their tactics to each enemy. When facing the Mongols, they were willing to meet charge with charge, but against the Latins they preferred harassment and manoeuvre. Standards and banners became vital tools amid the confusion. They guided men who could no longer hear orders, and they served as symbols of faith and honour. The rules of the orders insisted that no brother abandon the banner while it still flew. Losing sight of it meant losing the army itself, for panic spread quickly when the emblem fell. The survival of a single flag could rally scattered groups and turn flight into resistance. Once the lines collided, the contest dissolved into close combat. Lances splintered, swords bent, and maces hammered at helmets. A knight unhorsed was in grave danger. His armour that had protected him moments before now pinned him to the ground. During one civil war, several knights dismounted to aid a fallen companion and were cut down by enemy foot soldiers. Another veteran described being thrown from his saddle, trampled, and yet forced to rise and fight again, bleeding beneath a borrowed tunic used as a shield. Flank attacks were particularly feared. On marches, Muslim riders circled like wolves, seeking a weak side. Advance guards and rear guards became essential shields, and when they failed, panic followed. Still, individual bravery sometimes altered the outcome. Small bands of knights held bridges, guarded passes, or covered retreats, proving that even a handful of armoured men could matter greatly. Infantry formed the other half of the Christian host, though their quality varied widely. Pilgrims with little training marched beside hardened mercenaries. Undisciplined crowds could ruin the best plans, as happened when a mass of followers rushed for plunder and collapsed the order of an assault. Yet professional foot soldiers were invaluable. They protected fallen knights, helped them remount, and in one notable battle, their arrival turned defeat into victory by cutting down dismounted enemies. The experience of the Eastern Wars gradually taught that infantry, archers, and cavalry had to act together. Spearmen created a living wall against charging horsemen, while crossbowmen kept the enemy at a respectful distance. When this balance was achieved, even large Muslim forces hesitated to press home and attack. During the march toward Mansoura, such coordination allowed the Crusaders to protect their baggage and survive constant harassment. Archers and crossbowmen, in particular, shaped many encounters. Their bolts could kill horses, the true engines of Muslim warfare, and force mounted enemies to dismount behind makeshift barriers. Victories at river crossings and beach landings owed much to their steady fire. But when they were absent, as on one disastrous expedition, the army was helpless before swarming riders. Confined spaces like narrow streets reduced their value, and there, entire contingents perished without firing a shot. Behind the fighters stood a fragile network of support. Women carried water and bread, priests tended wounds and offered prayers. After long hours of combat, such help could determine whether men continued or collapsed. The aftermath brought its own realities. The gathering of spoils, the grim trade in prisoners, and the slow spread of infection among the wounded. Ransoms for notable captives reached astonishing sums, enough to shake kingdoms, while common soldiers were often sold into slavery. Not every campaign sought battle. At times, the mere presence of an army in the field deterred invasion, and wise commanders preferred negotiation to risk. Yet such restraint was rare when crusading enthusiasm burned hot. The clash near Gaza in 1239 revealed all these patterns in a single tragic day. Ambitious nobles led a large force into a valley, chosen without care. They neglected guards, exhausted their horses, and ignored warnings from experienced leaders. Muslim scouts studied the camp at leisure and summoned reinforcements from every direction. When the attack came, infantry rained arrows from the surrounding heights, while cavalry sealed the exits. Christian crossbowmen fought bravely but soon ran short of missiles. Desperate knights launched a charge that at first drove the enemy back, only to be lured into pursuit. Once drawn from their shelter, they were enveloped and cut down. The field was left strewn with stripped bodies, and the survivors could do little but bury the dead and mourn the captives carried to Egypt. Such episodes explain why the knight, proud symbol of medieval war, often found his power diminished in the east. The castles that dotted the coast offered security, but in open country, mobility and coordination mattered more than individual valour. Muslim armies, mastering these arts, dictated the terms of engagement. Western crusaders arrived with methods suited to different lands, and their failure to adapt led, repeatedly, to disaster. Yet battles alone did not decide the fate of the Latin realms. Most years passed without major engagements, and the slow loss of towns through siege and isolation proved more fatal than any single defeat. Only rarely did a confrontation like La Forbie or Mansoura shake the foundations of the kingdom. The final collapse came not from one decisive field, but from decades of pressure, dwindling manpower, and the inability to replace fallen strongholds. Medieval armies in the eastern Mediterranean lived under harsh limits. Maintaining a large force in the field for weeks was nearly impossible, and both Christian and Muslim commanders understood that grand campaigns to conquer wide territories were rarely practical. The Latin states in particular struggled even to gather enough men to leave the safety of their walls. Knights had to guard towers, sailors were needed in harbours, and mercenaries demanded pay that was often unavailable. Under such conditions, war took on a more modest shape. Instead of long marches aimed at annexation, conflict frequently appeared as sudden raids, swift strikes meant to wound rather than to occupy. For the Muslim powers, these expeditions formed one strand of a broader design to drive the Franks from the mainland. For the shrinking Christian communities, however, raiding became almost the only method by which they could carry the fight to their neighbours. These attacks might look scattered and aimless, yet they were woven into the daily fabric of frontier life. A raid could erupt without warning and end just as quickly, leaving behind burned fields, empty villages, and frightened survivors. The boundary between types of warfare was often blurred. An assault might begin as a raid and transform into a siege, or a march intended for battle might end in plunder alone. The purpose of a true raid, though, was clear. It sought neither to capture territory permanently, nor to engage the enemy in a decisive confrontation. Its goals were narrower: revenge for earlier attacks, the seizure of supplies, the extraction of tribute, or the humiliation of an opponent through the destruction of symbols dear to him. When a church at a sacred site was demolished or a prosperous suburb set ablaze, the message reached far beyond the immediate victims. Such expeditions required fewer men and less preparation than full campaigns. They promised quick profit in the form of livestock, grain, and captives, and they could be mounted even when treasuries were thin. Yet their impact should not be underestimated. A single destructive sweep could ruin a season's harvest or drive whole communities into flight, weakening the enemy long after the raiders had returned home. The Christians most often targeted the rural belt west of the Jordan River, a frontier dotted with small Muslim settlements and seasonal camps. From coastal cities and a handful of inland fortresses, Frankish parties rode out to strike these vulnerable zones. Villages near Bethsan suffered repeatedly. Livestock vanished, houses burned, and inhabitants were carried off. Sometimes the raiders met little resistance, for local garrisons withdrew rather than risk open battle. At other times, the Muslims gathered in strength, and what began as a raid ended in bloody defeat for the intruders. In the north, where Christian power remained stronger for longer, attacks reached larger towns. Forces led by the military orders dared to threaten places such as Barin, Hama, and Homs. These ventures mixed plunder with intimidation, reminding Muslim princes that tribute was expected and alliances fragile. Yet, success was never guaranteed. One expedition against Darbsak collapsed disastrously when the defenders proved far more numerous than anticipated. Muslim raids followed a different logic. Instead of striking isolated hamlets, they often aimed at the great Christian centres themselves. Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, and Antioch felt the pressure again and again. Columns of riders swept through orchards outside the walls, destroyed mills, and captured travellers. These blows did not seek to seize the cities outright. Rather, They softened defences, exhausted garrisons, and prepared the ground for future sieges. Under the energetic rule of Baybars, such attacks became almost annual rituals, each one tightening the noose around the coastal kingdom. War also reached across the sea. Christian fleets occasionally harried the Nile Delta, looting small ports and retreating before Egyptian forces could respond. Muslim leaders, though possessing fewer ships, attempted daring strikes against Cyprus and coastal traffic. One such venture ended in shipwreck off Limassol, but it revealed how far the conflict could range. The size of raiding forces varied widely. Some were little more than mounted bands, others resembled small armies including knights, sergeants, and archers. Infantry often accompanied Christian expeditions, which meant that these chevauchés were not the lightning cavalry dashes of Western Europe. Marching on foot under the Levantine sun, soldiers moved slowly and methodically, tearing up fields and villages as they went. Surprise remained essential, and many parties travelled by night to reach their targets at dawn. Scouts rode ahead to choose the richest routes and to warn of danger. Discipline determined success. When order held, the raiders returned laden with booty. When greed overcame caution, disaster followed. In one campaign, the advance guard rushed ahead in search of plunder and walked into an ambush that destroyed hundreds. Muslim commanders too exploited lapses, surrounding overconfident knights who had strayed too far from their comrades. Raids often answered raids. An offence on Cyprus provoked Frankish retaliation in Galilee. A Christian assault on Muslim villages brought a counter-strike against Bethlehem or Jaffa. Violence spiralled in cycles that few truces could halt. Sometimes the motive was more calculated. The Hospitallers attacked neighbouring emirates to enforce the payment of tribute, using fire and sword as tools of diplomacy. At other times, the aim was psychological. The tearing down of a revered church or mosque carried a message more powerful than any military victory. When a famous sanctuary was levelled, chroniclers across the sea repeated the story, and the morale of whole communities trembled. For Baybars, raiding became an instrument of strategy. Before laying siege to a fortress, he sent detachments to harass nearby cities, preventing them from sending aid. While Caesarea was under attack, Acre was struck to keep its garrison busy. Prior to the fall of Safae, Muslim riders ravaged Tyre, Sidon, and Montfort, spreading confusion about the true objective. Even Antioch was isolated in this way, its port assaulted and surrounding lands devastated, before the final blow fell. Repeated raids also wore down strongholds that were too formidable to storm at once. Acre endured years of such pressure, mills destroyed, suburbs burned, harvests ruined, until its ability to resist slowly ebbed. Similar treatment weakened Tripoli and the great castles of the interior. For the Christians, whose numbers dwindled with every decade, the raid gradually replaced the campaign as the highest form of action they could manage. When Crusaders arrived from Europe, their enthusiasm found expression not in conquests, but in bold forays that briefly revived the frontier spirit. Yet these efforts changed little. After each expedition, the land returned to Muslim hands, and the coastal kingdom shrank a little more. The Great Raid toward Tiberias in 1266 showed both the determination and the weakness of the Latins. Knights from every order, soldiers from Cyprus and Acre, and the French regiment marched together only to be shattered by an ambush near Safed. Peasants loyal to the Muslims hunted down the fugitives, a sign of how far the balance had shifted. Even the crusade of Prince Edward could aim no higher. His forces, including all the military orders, struck at St. George and later at Carcun, damaging the latter's defences but unable to hold the ground they crossed. These were brave gestures, yet they revealed a tragic truth. The era of expansion was over, and the Franks fought now only to remind the world that they still existed. Raiding was never a gentle form of war. Wherever such an expedition passed, the consequences followed a familiar pattern. Fields were laid waste, orchards chopped down, houses damaged, and a portion of the population killed or carried away. Gardens and irrigation channels, so essential in the dry Levant, were deliberate targets. Sugar plantations, water mills, and vegetable plots depended on carefully maintained systems of canals. Once these were broken, recovery could take years. For farming communities whose survival rested on a single harvest, the loss of one season could mean famine. Contemporary observers described methods that reveal how calculated this destruction could be. During a retreat from the hills near Banyas, a group of Frankish commanders devised a simple but effective way to burn a harvested field. Glowing charcoal was packed into hollow reeds and thrust deep into the piles of threshed grain, setting them alight beyond easy rescue. Muslim forces acted with equal purpose. When the aqueduct of Tripoli was smashed, the surrounding countryside lost its lifeline, and orchards withered long after the raiders had gone. Such blows were not random acts of cruelty. They were intended to cripple the enemy's economic base. Homes and public buildings rarely escaped untouched. Towers were dismantled to prevent their future use, and suburbs outside city walls were burned to create clear ground for later sieges. Religious structures suffered as well. A church converted into a mosque might be destroyed by Christian attackers, just as Muslim sanctuaries were razed by their opponents. These acts carried heavy symbolic weight, humiliating the other side and proclaiming dominance far beyond the immediate battlefield. Yet raids were not only about destruction. They offered opportunities for profit, and this prospect shaped behaviour as much as strategy. Captives were valuable commodities. Before setting out, raiders often agreed how prisoners would be taken and divided, for indiscriminate slaughter wasted potential gain. Some captives became bargaining pieces in later exchanges. Others were forced into labour, helping to build new fortifications for their conquerors. Markets in the great ports absorbed many of them, turning human misery into a routine element of commerce. Occasionally mercy appeared, as when a Muslim ruler returned, women and children seized near Tyre. But such gestures were exceptional. Booty of a different kind mattered even more. Livestock was the true treasure of the countryside. Sheep, goats, cattle, and horses could be driven away quickly and transformed into immediate wealth. Because animals were relatively scarce in the region, every herd lost was a serious blow to its owners, and a welcome prize for the raiders. Chronicles repeatedly mention the seizure of great and small beasts, suggesting that herds were as important as gold. Two expeditions illustrate what a single raid could achieve. In one campaign toward the village of St. George, crusading forces burned standing crops, carried off stores of grain, demolished houses, and inflicted heavy casualties on the inhabitants. Herds were rounded up and led back to the coast as spoils. A few years earlier, a Muslim army struck the outskirts of Acre. Gardens were set on fire, trees cut down, and the Templars' fortified mill destroyed. Dozens were killed, others taken prisoner, and cattle driven away. The physical damage was matched by the psychological shock delivered to the city. Such operations were attractive because they promised reward with limited risk. A well-organized party could strike swiftly and withdraw before a large enemy force gathered. For the Muslim states, raiding formed part of a wider design. Each foray softened the Christian defences and prepared the ground for future sieges. For the shrinking Latin communities, raids became almost the only means of demonstrating initiative. Lacking the strength for major campaigns, they relied on these swift blows to remind their neighbours that the coastal kingdom still possessed teeth. The price was paid by those least able to bear it. Farmers, shepherds and townspeople lived under constant threat. Every truce could be broken by a sudden ride across the frontier, and the cycles of retaliation grew ever more bitter. By the late 13th century, the countryside between the coast and the interior had become a scarred zone where neither side could feel secure. While raids gnawed at the land, the ultimate struggle centred on fortified places. The fate of the Latin presence was decided not in open fields but beneath city walls. Sieges, rather than battles, shaped the final decades of the Crusader states. Muslim rulers, especially the energetic Mamluk sultans, pursued a methodical program of reduction, taking one stronghold after another. When a castle fell, the surrounding territory followed almost automatically. Attackers and defenders employed a similar arsenal. To scale walls, they used ladders and tall wooden towers that crept forward on wheels. To smash defences, they relied on stone-throwing engines, mangonels, petraries, and the newer counterweight trebuchets, capable of hurling massive blocks with frightening accuracy. Close to the walls, rams and borers battered the masonry, while miners tunnelled beneath towers to collapse them. Those working at such dangerous proximity sheltered beneath timber roofs known as cats. The Muslims added distinctive weapons, pots of incendiary mixture that clung to wood and armour alike, and powerful hand slings that showered stones at a deadly rate. Numbers determined much of the outcome. Most Christian garrisons were small, rarely exceeding a few hundred effective fighters. Against them, the Muslim states could concentrate far greater forces, sometimes drawn from across Syria and Egypt. When Acre faced its final ordeal, its defenders counted only hundreds of mounted men, whereas the besiegers arrived in multitudes that dwarfed the city. Possessing similar technology, the side with deeper reserves usually prevailed. Preparation was therefore crucial. Before attacking, Muslim commanders assembled timber, iron, and craftsmen, often transporting ready-built engines from distant fortresses. Supplies of Greek fire, ammunition, and food were gathered, and trenches and palisades dug to protect the besieging camp. Defenders attempted to strengthen walls, build their own machines, and call for aid from the sea. Success depended on maintaining these lifelines. When relief failed to arrive, hunger and despair did the work of catapults. Some sieges ended with sudden violence, as at Antioch, where the walls were stormed with shocking speed. Others dragged on for months, like the long struggle for Damietta, where both sides endured disease, shortages, and endless skirmishing. Between these extremes lay countless encounters in which morale, leadership, and luck tipped the balance. Siege engines became a familiar sight wherever medieval armies gathered before a fortress. Commanders assumed that stone throwers and towering machines would break resistance, yet experience often proved otherwise. At Mount Tabor in 1217, the attackers tried to seize the hilltop without such devices, perhaps because the steep slopes made their use impossible. The assault soon collapsed, and many concluded that the absence of engines had doomed the effort. Even when machines were present, success was far from certain. During the long struggle for Damietta, batteries of petraries and trebuchets pounded the chain tower that guarded the Nile, but after many days the structure still stood firm. Dozens of engines lined the riverbank, hurling rocks at the city walls, yet their effect was slight, forcing the Crusaders to creep dangerously close to the defences and expose themselves to arrows and fire. Only occasional blows achieved visible results. One chronicler remembered that a single tower at Damietta showed real damage, struck repeatedly by the great trebuchet of the Austrian duke. Another writer credited the Hospitallers machine with shattering a corner bastion, but most accounts emphasize that plague and starvation, not artillery, brought the garrison to despair. Later campaigns offered brighter examples. At Kantara, in 1229, a massive trebuchet built by Anseau of Brie battered the walls until they crumbled, and although the rock beneath the castle remained unassailable, the defenders finally yielded. Similar effectiveness appeared at Beirut, where Lombard engines, carefully positioned, inflicted steady destruction. Elsewhere, the story repeated with mixed outcomes. At Kyrenia in the early 1230s, a forest of mangonels weakened the ramparts enough for an assault. But the attackers paid heavily and preferred to wait for hunger to finish the work. The siege of Tyre in 1242 relied on petraries that scarred the citadel, while the civil conflict known as the War of St. Sabas turned the Genoese quarter of Acre into a wasteland. Contemporary observers counted as many as 60 machines firing day and night, some bearing colourful names that reflected the pride of their crews. By the end, the city looked as if a foreign conqueror had passed through, proof that in the right circumstances artillery could dominate a siege. Yet not all methods relied on distant bombardment. To threaten a fortress directly, soldiers had to approach the walls, fill the surrounding ditch, and brave the defenders' missiles. The simplest tool was the ladder, though at Mount Tabor, a giant example was burned by Greek fire before any climber reached the parapet. More ambitious were siege towers, rolling wooden giants meant to deliver troops onto the battlements. In the Eastern wars, these devices rarely shone. At Damietta, they played little part, and at Kyrenia, 2 great towers were hauled across the fosse only to be set ablaze, their occupants rescued with difficulty. A different kind of tower proved useful at Beirut, where the Lombards erected a tall structure outside the city that overlooked the defences and allowed steady harassment. Perhaps the most versatile instrument was the movable shed known as the cat. At Damietta, where artillery disappointed, the Crusaders pinned their hopes on these iron-clad shelters to reach the walls and batter them at close range. Several attempts ended in disaster as Muslim defenders torched the machines and slaughtered the crews. Similar devices accompanied the French Crusade to Egypt decades later, guarding labourers who tried to build a causeway across the river, only to be burned repeatedly by the enemy. Veterans admitted relief when the last of these perilous shelters went up in flames, sparing them a night of dangerous duty. When climbing or smashing failed, armies turned underground. Miners tunnelled beneath towers, propping the cavities with timber that would later be burned to collapse the stone above. At Toron in 1197, Saxon silver miners nearly achieved such a triumph, and the frightened garrison considered surrender before relief arrived. Tunnels also served as secret passages into a fortress, a tactic attempted at Damietta, though with little success. In later years, Lombard troops undermined Beirut with damaging effect, while at Kyrenia both sides relied on movable screens and swarms of crossbowmen to protect these delicate operations. The geography of the region ensured that ships often joined the drama. Christian fleets hovering off Beirut in 1197 encouraged the Muslims to abandon the city, and at Damietta, seaborne, assaults captured the chain tower that blocked the Nile. Italian sailors repeatedly attacked the walls from their vessels, sometimes driven back by wind or fire. Control of the sea could change a siege entirely, as when John of Beirut slipped 100 men through an imperial blockade and revived the defence, or when the absence of friendly ships prolonged the struggle for Kyrenia. In 1258, a Genoese fleet attempted to rescue its beleaguered quarter at Acre with engines mounted on sailing ships, only to be defeated outside the harbour. Muslim commanders relied just as heavily on artillery, often as a prelude to direct attack. 3 engines sufficed to overwhelm weak defences at Caesarea in 1218, and mangonels thundered before the assault on Jerusalem 2 decades later. When Beaufort's garrison defied a treaty, machines forced their surrender without further effort. The campaigns of Baybars demonstrated the same pattern. At Caesarea, Safae, Beaufort, and many other places, engines pounded the walls while infantry prepared for the final rush. Montfort, Margat, Latakia, Tripoli, and Acre all endured similar storms, each showing how relentless bombardment could sap even the strongest fortifications. Mining ranked alongside artillery as a favoured Muslim technique. At Ascalon, in 1247 tunnels pierced the hill itself, opening a path directly into the castle. Other sieges combined digging with assault. And at Margat, a deep mine threatened to bring down the central tower, persuading the Hospitallers to yield. Around Tripoli and Acre, sappers worked tirelessly, undermining bastions while carabohas and hand slings showered stones at close range. These operations demanded that attackers fill the defensive ditch, often by pouring sand through narrow passages or advancing under mantlets and covered ways. Accounts of the final assault on Acre capture the ferocity of such moments. Before dawn, a massive drum summoned the host, and from every side foot soldiers advanced behind towering shields. Greek fire arced through the air, arrows fell like rain, and the noise overwhelmed the defenders' senses. Similar scenes unfolded at other strongholds where Muslim armies, backed by abundant manpower, pressed attacks with determination that Christian garrisons could rarely match. Psychological warfare accompanied physical force. At Safed Baybars sowed distrust within the walls by promising safety to Syrian auxiliaries, while targeting the Templars alone, then breaking his word after surrender. At Beaufort, forged letters undermined morale, and at Crack counterfeit orders from Tripoli persuaded the Hospitallers to open their gates. Such stratagems succeeded because many defenders already doubted their chances. Only occasionally did Muslim fleets take part, notably at Ascalon in 1247, where Egyptian ships supported the land assault. More often, Christian vessels hovered nearby, ready to rescue survivors when hope faded. The sea thus became both lifeline and escape route. Defenders responded with varied tactics. Some garrisons dared to fight outside their walls, with mixed results. A sortie from Jaffa in 1197 ended disastrously, while the Hospitallers at Margat in 1281 boldly routed a far larger host. At Acre, the early stages saw adventurous raids against enemy engines, one ending in comic confusion when knights tangled in tent ropes and a man drowned in a latrine. Countermining offered another line of resistance, as at Arsuf and Safed, where underground battles raged in darkness. More commonly, however, Christian defenders relied on passive endurance. Shortages of men discouraged risky action, and many fortresses simply withdrew behind successive walls, while engines hurled stones in reply. Relief armies sometimes lifted sieges, as at Tehran in 1197 or Jerusalem in 1229, yet such help grew rarer with time. Comparing the record reveals a stark contrast. Christian sieges often dragged on for months and ended through starvation rather than assault, reflecting limited manpower. Muslim campaigns, by contrast, were swift and violent, usually concluded within weeks by concentrated attacks. The larger resources of the sultans allowed relentless pressure, while raids devastated the countryside and isolated each stronghold before the blow fell. Accounts of medieval sieges often diverged sharply depending on who told the story. Christian chroniclers and Muslim historians looked at the same events through different lenses, and their descriptions of victory and defeat rarely matched. After the fall of Damietta, many Western writers insisted that the city's Muslim inhabitants had died only from hunger and disease during the long blockade. Arabic authors, by contrast, spoke of a brutal massacre carried out once the Crusaders entered the streets. The truth is difficult to recover, yet the contrast reveals how each side wished to present itself as honourable while portraying the enemy as cruel and merciless. Western narratives frequently depicted Muslim armies as naturally inclined towards slaughter, as if every captured town were destined to drown in blood. Closer examination suggests a more complex reality. Victorious Muslim commanders, especially when dealing with professional garrisons, often behaved with restraint. During the campaigns of Baybars, surrender usually brought the right to leave with life intact. There were notorious exceptions. Above all, the fate of the Templars at Safe, who were promised safe conduct only to be executed afterward. The fierce defence of Arsuf may also have provoked revenge, for some Arabic voices admitted that prisoners there were killed in anger. Yet these episodes stood out precisely because they were not the normal pattern. Earlier in the century, harsher outcomes appeared more common. At Jaffa, Ascalon, and Tiberias, entire communities were put to the sword after resistance collapsed. As time passed, massacres tended to occur in places where large civilian populations were trapped inside the walls. Panic among refugees and soldiers could turn a chaotic entry into uncontrolled killing, while the presence of unarmed townspeople tempted victors to plunder. The final struggle for Acre illustrated this grim dynamic. When Muslim troops first broke into the Templar quarter, their violence led to a counterattack that destroyed them. Yet the episode showed how quickly discipline could vanish amid fear and greed. Similar scenes unfolded at Antioch and Tripoli in the closing decades of the Crusader states. Surrender, therefore, offered no certain guarantee. Many garrisons were allowed to depart peacefully, but others paid with their lives. The difference often depended on the temper of the commander, the length of resistance, and the mood of the troops. In the wars between rival Christian factions, sieges usually ended with negotiated terms, not bloodshed, yet this reflected weakness rather than mercy. Latin armies rarely possessed the strength to storm a city by force and were obliged to compromise. Muslim forces, by contrast, could choose between clemency and terror because they held the decisive advantage. Two famous sieges reveal how these contrasting approaches shaped events. The capture of Damietta by the Fifth Crusade demonstrated the patient method favoured by Christian armies. Before sailing from Acre, the Crusaders gathered supplies for half a year, assembled fleets, and prepared engines with careful attention. On reaching Egypt, they fortified their camp on the western bank of the Nile with ditches and walls, while mangonels hammered the distant towers. Opposing them stood not only the city's garrison, but also a field army under Al-Kamil, entrenched on the eastern shore, where it could threaten any attempt to cross the river. The first obstacle was the great chain tower that controlled movement on the Nile. Direct assault by land was impossible, and mining offered no hope, so the Crusaders constructed an ingenious floating fortress from two ships bound together and protected with soaked hides. After several failed attacks, the device succeeded and the tower fell. Yet this victory did not open the road to the city. The Muslim army repeatedly blocked the river with dams and sunken boats, and winter raids harassed the camp. Only internal discord within the Muslim leadership allowed the Crusaders to cross to the eastern bank in early 1219 and tighten the blockade. Once across the river, the attackers again concentrated on defence. Bridges linked both banks, islands were fortified, and ships patrolled the water. The Crusaders recognised that they lacked the numbers to storm the walls while guarding their rear against Al-Kamil's troops at Fariska. When many soldiers wished to return home, new contingents from Europe barely replaced the losses. Attempts to break the stalemate with cats, towers, and mines achieved little. Muslim sorties destroyed several machines and Greek fire burned others. An ill-judged attack on the enemy camp ended in heavy casualties. In the end, Damietta succumbed, not to assault, but to endurance. Disease spread within the crowded city, supplies dwindled, and hope of relief faded. After 19 months, the garrison opened the gates. The Crusaders had shown discipline and organization, yet their victory owed more to blockade than to military brilliance. The siege illustrated the strengths and limitations of Latin warfare. Careful preparation, strong defensive camps, and persistence, but an inability to force a rapid decision. The fall of Acre in 1291 unfolded in a very different manner. By then, the balance of power had shifted decisively toward the Mamluk Sultanate. Before the main host arrived, detachments circled the city to harass the countryside. When the Sultan reached the plain in early April, engines from Syria were already on the road, accompanied by carpenters, stonecutters, and thousands of labourers. The Muslim camp spread around the landward walls, its own trenches and palisades, forming a fortress opposite the Christian defences. Inside Acre, the inhabitants prepared as best they could, gathering missiles and organising sectors of the ramparts. But their numbers were small compared with the besiegers. The first task for the attackers was to neutralise the broad moat. Under cover of shields and wooden screens, sappers filled the ditch and advanced their carabohas and stonecutters to the base of the towers. The Christians attempted bold sorties, yet one ended in confusion and loss, convincing the leaders to remain behind the walls. From that moment, the initiative lay entirely with the Muslims. Day and night, trebuchets battered the masonry while miners gnawed beneath foundations. The northeastern angle near the accursed tower became the focal point. The barbican of King Hugh was abandoned and burned. Counter mines collapsed. One tower after another cracked under the blows. When the king's tower fell, the enemy poured through the breach. A desperate defence with a heavy cat and the remaining engines delayed them, but only briefly. Before dawn on the 18th of May, the final assault began. Drums thundered, and columns of infantry advanced behind great shields while Greek fire and arrows filled the sky. Once the accursed tower was taken, resistance fragmented into street fighting. The military orders fought stubbornly at St. Anthony's Gate, and their master fell mortally wounded, but the tide could not be turned. Muslim horsemen entered by the shore, and the city dissolved into chaos. For 10 more days, the Templars held their seaside fortress until mines brought it crashing down, burying attackers and defenders alike. Acre was then burned and dismantled so that it could never rise again. These two sieges, separated by 7 decades, reveal the transformation of warfare in the eastern Mediterranean. Christian armies could still display courage and inventiveness, yet they lacked the manpower to impose swift conclusions. Muslim forces, drawing on vast resources, pressed relentlessly for immediate results and were willing to accept heavy losses to achieve them. Their combination of artillery, mining, psychological pressure, and overwhelming numbers gradually stripped the Latin states of every major stronghold between 1265 and 1291. Siege warfare in this era relied on familiar tools and little technological change. But the way those tools were used made all the difference. The fate of cities depended less on individual machines than on the ability to sustain pressure, protect camps, and command the loyalty of soldiers. In the long contest between coast and hinterland, the Muslims mastered these demands more effectively. Yet the endurance of places like Damietta reminds us that determination and careful planning could still challenge even the greatest empires. The story of these sieges is therefore not simply one of inevitable conquest. but of human resilience tested against the grinding machinery of medieval war.